Okay, so today we're now turning into the third synoptic gospel, which is the book of Luke. This is the last optical gospel we're going to be learning. Optical gospel, I mentioned Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Um, Luke is a little bit different from the last two books that we have shared. As I mentioned, according to the many of the scholars, we trust that and we believe that Mark was the very first book where the gospel was written, and then Matthew had referenced the book of Mark to write the Matthew. Luke is also the same. Luke also referenced the book of Mark as well, but not only just a reference to Mark, but also reference other things, which we're going to discuss today. So we're going to talk about some of the characteristic of the book of Luke and what the difference is between the Luke versus other optical gospel. Between book of Matthew and Mark, the overlapping points between the two books are almost 90%, which means 90% of the contents are identical. That's why many of the church, they only teach either Mark or Matthew because there's no reason to just teach both books because it's literally covers exactly the same thing. Um, you may or may not have noticed when I was actually going through the Matthew and Mark, it's literally we covered the contents twice. Literally, that's what we did. Um, the the difference between Matthew and Mark is that Matthew is the actual disciples of Jesus Christ who followed and work under the teachings of Jesus Christ and followed him throughout the Jesus' ministry. So he was very close to Jesus. However, Mark, on the other hand, was not a disciple. He was certainly a follower, but he was not a disciple. So he was not as close as Matthew. Then the question comes, then how did Mark knew every details what Jesus did, what he said, where he went? How does he know all the details? And as I mentioned, Mark was literally just kind of taking the experience of Peter. You can think of it as the Peter's story. Mark is the one who actually wrote the book, and he literally took all the informations and all the experiences that Peter had with Jesus. Is literally he wrote it down in the book. So this is Peter's story rather than a Mark story. Mark is the one who actually wrote it, and he became an author. But the ultimate author is the Peter. So Matthew and Mark, they both have similar experiences because they followed Jesus very closely. On the other hand, Luke is a little bit different. How different? Luke is not a Jewish. He's a Greek. So out of all the books in the Bible, entire book of, entire New Testament, when you actually look at it, which is there are 27 books in the New Testament. And out of 27 books, 2 books are written by the pagan. And that pagan is Luke. Luke wrote Luke and Acts. 2 books was written by Luke, which was a Greek, not a Jewish. And it's amazing how the pagan was able to actually record the Bible. And then Luke is also he was a medical doctor. Because he was a medical doctor and he was a very, very detail oriented person. He knows how to document things. He knows how to actually get to the root of it, and he knows how to actually just, get to the facts rather than just hearing the story from here or there and then just assuming that's what happened. But he's not the type of person who actually study, he validates, he actually confirms the informations before he takes into his own story. So he was he described it in very, very concise, but at the same time very detail oriented. Of course, Book of Luke overlaps with Matthew and Mark because it's the same story, right? However, there are portions of the story that it is not recorded in Book of Matthew or Mark, but only recorded in Luke. There are at least about 30 stories that are not recorded in Book of Matthew or Mark, is recorded in Luke, only in Luke. When you look at the chapters from Matthew, I believe that Matthew is the last chapter of the Matthew is chapter 28, and Luke is chapter 16. So the very first book, which is the book of Mark, only has a 16 chapter, which is not a whole lot. Matthew, when he referenced it, he actually kind of like extended the story and made it a little bit longer and more details in Matthew. He kind of like put a little meat to the story. So he actually recorded it and made it almost 28 chapters. When you look at the Luke has the 24 chapters, which is more than Mark, but less than Matthew. But within those 24 chapters of a book of Luke, he recorded 30 more stories that are not recorded in either Matthew or Mark. The question is, how did he actually add 30 more stories in the book, but less than Matthew? It's amazing how he could actually have done this. The reason is because he was able to actually just to make the story very concise, but detailed enough to tell the stories of those stuff. But at the same time, he was able to just compact the story to make it into this book. If Luke did not record it, we would not have known all these 30 different stories that we know very well. And obviously, some of the stories of prodigal sons is only recorded in book of Luke. So if Luke did not record it, we would not have known this. And a lot of the stories that are actually recorded in this books, if the Luke did not do what he did, then many of the story would have been missed. But luckily, Luke actually captured all those details, and then he actually recorded in this book. That's how we get to know this. So, how did pagan Greek medical doctor became a believer of Jesus Christ? But at the same time, how was he able to record the story of Jesus Christ? If he was not a disciple, if he was not a follower of Jesus, how does he know all the details of all these stories that he recorded? Let's just take a look at the book of Luke for a second. Let's just take a look. Chapter 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitness and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Okay. So when you read this chapter 1 at the beginning, not like the other books that we have studied, which is Matthew and Mark, neither of those authors have actually did not write why he's writing those books. But Luke, on the other hand, he's a little bit different. He actually writes the purpose of why he actually wrote this book. So it's not like the other two authors. He has a structures and organized the way he writes things. Very detail oriented. Because as he was studying to become a medical doctor, obviously, he has been trained in a certain way to write. So compared to two books that we have seen, as you know, New Testament is written in Greek, not in Hebrew like Old Testament. But Jews, the Israelites, are not Greek. Of course, they have learned the Greek because that is the common language that people were using at the time. But under the Roman Empire, their language they spoke was Aramaic, whereas their actually written language is Latin. So the Greek is not a spoken language. So this is the kind of like second language to them. So you could imagine. Well, myself, Daisy, right? We're not born here in the United States. We immigrated from a different country. Well, you can tell how bad my English is. I'm trying to learn English, but my English is not as good as the people who were born here and raised here and use as a primary language, because English for me is not a primary language. So even though I try to speak and write in English, my English is terrible, and I know very well. Imagine when I write versus the people who actually use English as a primary language writes. Of course, there's a differences because first of all, my expressions, my vocabulary, they're all, short compared to the people who's, been using the language from the youth. By the same token, Matthew, Mark wrote the books in Greek, but for them, it's not a primary language. It's a secondary language for them. They learn to actually understand, speak, and write. Compared to Luke, Luke is a Greek. He was born and Greek is his primary language. So you could imagine the way Matthew and Mark write versus the Luke writes, there is a difference. The level is not the same. The Luke's expressions and vocabularies and grammars and the way he writes things are at the like for example, if Matthew and Mark was at the level 1, Luke is almost at the highest level. And on top of that, he's one of the elite member. He was he was actually very educated, intellectual person. So when he writes, it's very different. And it's beautifully expressed. And the way he writes, we can picture we can imagine the story that he's writing. That's how great his writing is. Unfortunately, we're only reading the Bible that translated either in English or other languages. So of course those expressions and those sophisticated the way he writes is all diminished, so that we don't see those things and we can't see the difference between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're all look the same to us. But when you actually read in Greek, you will see the big difference. It's not the same level as the one that the previous two books that we have read. I was like, wow, this is like it's certainly like very top level compared to what the other two books said. Imagine one of the things that actually when I was young, I was actually reading some classic the literature, from Russia, from Europe, from America. So different authors wrote different books and the different literatures. And when I was actually reading those classic literature, I I read in Korean, which was a translated version of the literature. And when I actually reading the stories, for example, as Romeo and Juliet, which is written by the Shakespeare, right? And compared to like, you know, the Hemingway's book. Well, for me, it's the same because I'm reading the translated version of the literature that I'm reading. So there is not much difference between the two books. What really shocked me was when I actually read the Shakespeare's the book in English, and I was shocked because, oh my God, the way he writes things is very different than how the Hemingway writes. When you actually read the Hemingway's the literature, his expression is very short, concise, simple for people to anybody to understand. When you read the Shakespeare's the book, he doesn't write a very short expression, but he's writing is like very poetic. Every words are like very poetic. It's beautifully written, and I don't know how a human could actually thought of this kind of expressions. The way he writes is very very different. So I was literally, surprised how he was able to write the books compared to how other writers are actually writing. And it's almost the same. The when Matthew and Mark writes versus Luke writes, they're at the very different level. And when you think about this, as I mentioned, Luke is a medical doctor. So then, my questions to you is, how do I know that Luke was actually a medical doctor? How do you think I know that um, the Luke is a medical doctor? Do you guys knew that Luke is a medical doctor, correct?
Yeah, I've heard that
Yeah. So how do you know the Luke is a medical doctor?
because I was told.
Which is very honest answer. Anyone else? Everyone knows that Luke was a medical doctor, right? No? Look, Rick is the only one? Okay. So, huh? You heard of it. Okay. So Daisy heard of it too. Okay. So Luke is very famous person, right? That everybody knows Luke, correct? Is there anybody who doesn't know Luke? Could we be a little bit, share your thoughts and make it a little more dynamic here?
I don't know.
You don't know Luke was a medical doctor, or you don't know Luke much?
No, not much. But I didn't know it was a medical doctor.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't told. I mean, I wasn't told that. But
Okay. Ingyu, do you know?
I didn't know.
You did not know. Okay, so there are many people did not know then. But at least you know Luke, right? Yeah. So a lot of people know Luke, and he's very famous person in the New Testament. So then, how do we know Luke? So we assume that the Bible records about Luke a lot, right? Talks about Luke in the New Testament. How many times do you think the New Testament mentions about Luke in the New Testament? What do you think? How many times do you think the New Testament talks about Luke? Hmm? Do you only see the book named Luke? Luke is not even mentioned in the Bible?
If he is, I'm assuming it's not.
In the New Testament, Luke's name appeared in the New Testament 3 times. That's it. Only 3 times Luke's name appeared in the Bible. One in the Colossians, another times in 2 Timothy, and third book is Philemon. Those are the only 3 places where Luke's name is appeared. No other places, not in the book of Luke, not in the book of Acts, his name does not appear at all. Only 3 places that Luke's name appeared in the Bible, the New Testament. It's only 3 places. Where? Colossians, 2 Timothy, and Philemon. Those are the only 3 places you will find his name. So let's take a look at Colossians chapter 4. Colossians chapter 4. We're going to read verse 14. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. This is how we know that Luke was a physician, which is a medical doctor. This is how we know him as a doctor. And then, Luke, because of a Luke, in today's world, there is a lot of medical and missionaries are either doctors or they're actually go there to really treat other people. Those missions are started by Luke because he was the originators who started sort of medical missionary activities. He was the very original person. So then, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I mentioned, so how does Luke knows all the details of what Jesus did, what Jesus said? How does he know if he was not a disciples nor the followers of a Jesus at the time when he's ministering? Luke was very, very close to Paul. He was almost disciples of Paul. And who is Paul? Is he an intelligent person or he was just not educated person like the disciple? As you know, Paul was a highly educated person, elite member, right? He learned from the top schools and he studied all his life. So he's a very intelligent and educated person. And imagine 2 elite members, Luke and Paul. They talk, they discuss, they learn. Luke learned a lot from Paul. So then, that's great. Then now both 2 elite members who intellectual person who actually shared the story of Jesus Christ and shared the faith and a lot of a lot of good stuff. But of course, the Paul was not the disciples nor the followers of Jesus Christ when he was ministering. So Paul does not know all the stories of what Jesus said or what he did, right? He only experienced how Jesus met him when he was actually going to Damascus to really just to persecute the church, and then onward. So he doesn't know all the details of the stories or the what Jesus said, what he did, where he went. He doesn't know. Then how does Luke was able to actually capture this information in detail? So before we actually get to that point, as we just read in Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, let's just take a look at what he said, what Paul said. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you. I think this is a very, very important message that Paul is actually sharing with us. Imagine Luke was beloved physician. What does that mean? Beloved physician. A lot of people loved him. He had the character to really just care other people, and that's why other people loved him. So I want you to think about this for a moment. When you actually get sick and when you seek for, medical treatments, you go and seek the doctor. How many times you felt that your doctor is very friendly and kind and he really cares for you, and then he just spent time to treat you well? How many times you felt that, from your doctors that you seek, whether you're a family doctor or different doctors that you visit? How many times you felt that oh, doctor really cares about me, that he really understands my pain, he really cares for me, he's just doing everything that he just wants to just take care of me? How many times did you feel that way? Huh?
I'm in the doctor like 10 so I can't remember.
Okay. How about other people?
I just saw my primary, and I have a very
Oh, that's good. That's good.
I've had those for that.
From what I hear though, it seems like a lot of want to get you kind of checked off the list. They have a lot of, so kind of I did see a physician like a year ago for my job. You're just out. From what I
The one still said good for years. My primary physician, I've known her for years, so you kind of she knows who you are. She knows take you off and move on.
Well, I've seen my family doctor for the last probably 30 years, and he treats me still like a new patient. He doesn't know me. He doesn't really care. And then it's just not that doctor, but I met several doctors. I hate hospital, to be honest with you. I hate hospital because I got sick a lot of times when I was young. I hate to go to a hospital, and I can't think of any doctor that I have met so far. So far, I wouldn't say all of it, but at least the doctor that I have seen, I haven't seen a single doctor in my life that I felt like, oh, he really cares for me, and he really just spent time and trying to treat me well. If they just very, very I'm, like Ricky mentioned, because they have a lot of patience, and they seem to be just just see me for a few minutes, and then just it's like a revolving door. I just sometimes I'm sitting at the lobby for I'm supposed to meeting the doctor at 3 o'clock. I have to wait for another hour to sit there just waiting for the doctor to call me. And I was pissed off. A lot of times I haven't met a single doctor that I respect or that I have actually seen that they really care. By the way, Daisy's parents, both of them are doctor. I'm sure. So that's your sister, yeah. So her whole family is the medical doctor, except Daisy. Daisy was actually her father wants her to be a doctor, but she just kind of rebelled, so she just went to technology rather than medical field. But I'm sure your family member is a little bit different, but my personal experience is like that. And I hear from a lot of different people that feel the same way. It's very difficult to meet the doctors that are really care and they just really just like um, give their hearts to their patient. I'm sure there are, but there are not many, for sure. There are not many. But Luke, on the other hand, was different. He seemed to very care for the people he was treating. And because of his character, because of his attitudes, and because of his characters, because of his patience, because of a lot of the things that he has done, he was a beloved physician, respected, loved. When I actually read this very simple statements that Paul made, he never used these expressions with anyone else. Luke was the only person that Paul expressed that he was the beloved physician, which means even Paul acknowledged that everyone loved Luke. Way he actually treat people, way he actually talk to people, where when how he actually just deal with people's in very kind way. So he was beloved. You remember the time when Jesus went to the Jordan River and then when he was baptized by the John the Baptist, there was a voice from the heavens says, "This is my son, this is my beloved son." Jesus was also the beloved son. Now I actually think about it. If someone described me, would anyone describe me as beloved key? I don't think so. And same for you too. When someone actually describe you, will people call you as beloved so and so? I think it's a little bit difficult to be called as beloved so and so. But this is kind of things that we should look for. This is a kind of person we should be. Beloved person. That means we need to have that kind of a characters in us when we treat others. We treat people with sympathy, empathy, love, kindness, gentleness, goodness, all these things. That's kind of things that how we should treat others. So is that means we need to train ourselves to be a good person? In a way, yes, but not by my might or not by my power. Through the help of the Holy Spirit that we are able to do so. Not because we're kind, not because we're good, not because we're lovable, because the Holy Spirit captures our heart and captivate us. That within me, that His love, His kindness, His patience, His goodness, His gentleness overflows. That can be delivered to the person that we are dealing or interface with. when we do that, not because my own character, because of the characteristic of the Holy Spirit, we will become a beloved person. So I'm not advocating that we have to practice and we have to train ourselves to become a good person or a beloved person or try to become a beloved person. But when we just immerse and influenced by the Holy Spirit, we will become beloved person, just like the Luke. So this is something I think it is important for us to really understand. So coming back to the story again, Luke. What is the name Luke means? Does anybody know the meaning of name Luke? Anybody know? No? It sounds like a lot of the story that I share seem to be new to many of the people. Is that always the case?
Seems like it.
Okay. Does the Luke name familiar to you at all? It's very similar to the things that you know very well. How about the word lune? Lumen? No? Doesn't ring a bell? When you actually go to hardware stores, when you actually buy light bulb, what you will see is lune. It is the brightness of the bulb. Luke is Latin word, means light. Lune is the unit of a measurement of a brightness. Lucas films, you know that, right? Star Wars, same thing. It is light, which means Luke, his name itself is light to this world, which is a great name, Luke. And he was the light to this world. And when you actually took a look at it from Luke chapter here, of course, many of the scholars says, well, when did actually this book was written? Obviously, nobody knows exactly when this book of Luke was written. But there's some clue as to when Luke actually wrote this book. It's very difficult to tell exactly what year, but one of the things that you will find here is Luke wrote 2 books in the Bible, in the New Testament. He wrote Luke first, and then he wrote Acts next. When you read the book of Acts, if you ever read the book of Acts, it records the story that Paul was captured and he was delivered to Romans, and which is he went to Rome at the end before he was executed. That's the time of the Roman Empire. Nero was ruling at the time when Paul was executed. Peter and Paul, they both executed very similar period. But Luke records how Paul was carried over to Rome and when he was executed. When Paul was executed was somewhere between AD 60 and early 60s, which means if Luke wrote this book before Paul was executed, and if Luke was written before Acts, that means this book of Luke, was written before Acts was written. So probably early 60s is where we can project that he wrote this. As I mentioned, we don't know that when this book was written for exactly what year. Neither any of the books that we see, Matthew, Mark, we don't know exactly when this book was actually written. But that's the kind of period when Book of Luke was written. And as I mentioned, Paul and Luke were the two very important individuals, besides the disciples, important persons in the New Testament. Do you know how many books that Paul wrote in New Testament? How many books are in New Testament? I mentioned there are 27 books in the New Testament. Out of 27 books, we project that Paul wrote either 13 or 14 books. Paul himself wrote 13 or 14 books in the New Testament. What does that mean? Almost half the New Testament was written by Paul. There are no other authors compared to Paul wrote such many books in the New Testament, or any books. And then Luke wrote 2 books. Combine those 2 individuals, when you actually count the number of books, either 15 or 16 books, which means more than a half of those New Testaments written by these 2 individuals, which is very significant. Without these 2 individuals, we would not have known a lot of the stuff that we know today. We would not have built our faith. But because of these 2 individuals, we are able to actually understand the true gospel. It's very, very important. And where did they meet, these 2 individuals? Unfortunately, New Testament does not talk much details of Luke. So we don't know exactly where he came from, where they met, we don't know. But one thing that we know is this. When you turn to Acts, Acts chapter 20. I'm going to read from verse 1. After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Sopater the Varian, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius and Derbes and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. These went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. When you actually read this part, Paul, he went to he went to Greece, and he spent there for 3 months, and then he sailed to Syria, and then went to Macedonia. And then when you look at verse 6, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. So they left the Philippi and on the day of unleavened bread. In 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. So he went to Troas and stayed there 7 days. What it means is that he said, where we stayed for 7 days. So who's we? We include Luke, the one who actually writing the story of a book of Acts. So what we can see is Paul and Luke went to Troas together. So Luke was participating and joined with Paul for his ministry journey. So what we do know is Luke was traveling with Luke to proclaim the Gospels around the Asian area. So therefore, we don't know exactly when they met, where they met. We don't know the details because the book does not describe the detail. However, we do know they traveled together and preached the Gospels, with Paul. So that's how we know they actually kind of traveled together. And later on, when you actually remember, I mentioned that the book, the New Testament, only talks about Luke in a few times in the books. When you turn to 2 Timothy, chapter 4. 2 Timothy is the last book that Paul wrote before he was executed. So when you turn to 2 Timothy chapter 4, if we read from verse 9, do your best to come to me soon, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. So who's with Paul? Luke. The reason that Luke was always with Paul was not only Luke was participating in Paul's ministry, but at the same time, remember, is a medical doctor. And he seemed Paul was sick all the time. And he was carrying his sickness, right? So he needed a lot of the medical attention. And Luke was always there to take care of Paul because Luke truly loved Paul. So he was always there with Paul to taking care of him. And when he was captured in the prison in Rome, Luke was there with him. And he was alone with Paul. There's nobody else was with him. Everyone left. So he was calling, please bring Mark. He's useful to me. I'm only with Luke. Nobody else was with me. Everybody left. So when Paul was alone and lonely, Luke was keeping the company for Paul all the time until the last day, until he was executed. Luke was always there with Paul. So you could imagine, while they're together, how much of faithful discussions they had between the two and how they shared the love of Jesus Christ, and then what he recorded about Paul and what happened to his ministry. So that's how Luke knows all the details and Paul's ministry very well, and then he was able to write book of Acts. So coming back to Luke chapter 1 again. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. So what it means is that at the time, there are many people trying to write all the stories and narrative of Jesus' ministry. There are a lot of people try to write. When Luke looked those the stories that was written, and when he reviewed, some are good, some are not good, some stories are kind of misled, not true. So he has read many written narrative of the many people who tried to record the story of Jesus Christ. But when he read those stories, he felt that this is not good enough, or it is not as accurate as it should be. So what he did was, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and minister of the word have delivered them to us. So he actually looked at it, reviewed it. He actually just to kind of like assess all the writings of those stories and narrative and all the eyewitness people who actually just experienced Jesus' ministry. After he reviewed, verse 3 says, "It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write unorderly accounts for you." What it means is that after he reviewed the documents, and he also interviewed the people who have seen and worked and experienced Jesus' work, he individually interviewed those people to validate exact stories and confirm not just the hearing from one person, but interviewed many different people, not only just the readings, what they wrote, but confirming the stories, whether what he said, what he wrote is actually valid, whether it's accurate. He reviewed them thoroughly. So he was able to analyze and validate all the informations, and he only recorded what is facts and what is validated. So that's how he was able to record all these details, because he have interviewed so many different peoples. He have read so many different narrative and so many books that people tried to write. And then he wanted to actually make it orderly. What happened was, when you read the story of Matthew and Mark, it is not in chronological order. What it means is that whatever they come to their mind and what they thought of, oh, I remember this story. Oh, I remember this story. So the story is not organized well. It is not written in sequences. They just, whatever that came to their mind, whatever they remember, okay, this happened. Oh, that happened. And then Matthew did the same thing. Yeah, I remember that happened. So they literally just wrote the stories, not organized well. Why does people have hard time reading the Bible and understanding Bible? One of the challenges that many people are facing is this. Bible is not written or not actually composed or structures or organized in order. It's like all over the place. Especially when you read the Old Testament, books are going back and forth, like stories are like all over the places. Like it's very difficult for anybody to read the Bible and understand, because it's not in order. And same thing with New Testament. New Testaments are very similar. It's not in order. It's all over the places. So it's extremely difficult for us to like put it in order. It is our work to put the books and stories in order. It's very difficult. However, Luke, on the other hand, is not like any other author. He didn't want to just write random stories in here or there because it just happened. But he placed the stories in order and structures and organized, because that's how he's been trained. When he became a medical doctor, he learned a certain way to structure the stories and how to write in order. He follows a certain structures and methodology to really just write the book. That's why the book of Luke is different than any other books that you read. So, coming back, he said, verse 3 once again, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely. So he actually took a look at it very closely for some time past. So whatever had happened in the past, he took a look at it very closely and examined it, validated, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainly concerning the things you have been taught. Now, he's writing a story to this Theophilus. Now, there's a lot of questions about this person, Theophilus. Who is this person, Theophilus? Obviously, there is no, artifacts or the details of who this person is, because the Bible does not really discuss or describe the details of who this person is. So, question is, who is he? Who is Theophilus? Well, as you read the story of the Bible, have you ever questioned who this person is? Have you ever questioned about this person? Right. Nobody really just, pay attention to Theophilus. not many people just like paying attention who this is. So then, let's talk about this for a moment. Is this a person? Or is this just referencing someone that are not specifying or specifically mentioning his name? First of all, let's take a look at who is Theophilus. This name Theophilus is structured, the name is structured in two words, Theo and Phileus. What is the meaning of Theo? What does it mean, Theo?
Uncle. Just kidding. That's Theo.
Deus. Theo means God. Deus. Phileus. What is a Phileus?
Friend.
Friend. Phileus is, you heard about the 4 different kinds of love: agape, eros, storge, and Phileus. Phileus is friendly love, which means if you actually just translate his name, Theophilus, friend of God. Friend of God. So is this a name? Or is this someone Luke is actually just referencing that people who love Jesus were considered him as a friend of Jesus? Now, there are many different scholars interpret it differently. Some people says this is the actual person's name. Whether another scholar says no, this is not a name, but it's just he's just not calling out the name, but he's just calling out someone, but not specifically using his name. One group of scholars says this is a person. The reason they actually saying this is actually a person is because how Luke actually calls him. The most excellent. So this Greek word, Christos, means most excellent. So then, let's think about this. What does this mean, most excellent? If you ever gone to the court, ever, whether you actually serving as a juror or for other, the tickets that you receive from your, the officers, if you ever gone to the court, what do you call the judge? When you stand before the judge, what do you call judge?
Your Honor.
Your Honor. You don't call it judge so-and-so, right? You never call judge as judge. You always call the judge Your Honor. Then Your Honor, is that a title? Is that a name? No, neither. It's not the title, it's not the name. Your Honor is not the way you are actually called, officially judge. But we call Your Honor. We kind of like lift his positions, respect, and we show the respect, and we call it Your Honor. We don't say judge. Everyone says your honor. Same thing. This krastistos means you're most excellent. It is not the title, but it is just the lifting and respected someone who's high official person. So when you actually look at the book of Acts chapter 23. Acts chapter 23. Acts chapter 23, verse 26. Claudius Lysias, to his excellency, the governor Felix, greetings. You see, there's also mention His Excellency, the governor Felix. So Felix is the governor. And when he calls out the excellency. This excellency is krastistos, the same word that Luke used for this person, Theophilus. And chapter 24, 26, when he calls the governors, he called most excellent, which is very similar to what we actually call your honor. So when someone calls out the high official person, they called most excellent, which means kratistos. So it's definitely calling out someone. It could be a person who financially supported Luke and believed in Jesus Christ. But he didn't want to just name who it is because he's in high official. He didn't want to specifically mention this person because if someone is in a high officials and if he, the believer of Jesus Christ, he could receive some, persecutions, or he could be, removed from his positions. He can take many different disadvantage if his name is revealed. So Luke did not want to name names, but just writing to a person without calling out his name. You're just saying, most excellent Theophilus. So he could be named. It could be someone who's just calling out as the general name. Or it could be he was actually calling out the friends of Jesus, which means could be church. We don't know for sure who this is. But when you actually look at the book of Luke and book of Acts, let's turn to book of Acts for a second, which is the second book he wrote. Acts chapter 1, verse 1 says this: In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up after he had given commands through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. He presented himself alive to them after his suffering by many proof, appearing to them during 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. And while staying with them, he ordered them not to depart from Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise of the fathers. So, even the book of Acts, Luke mentioned in the first book. What is that in the first book? The book of Luke, which he recorded the stories of the life of, or the ministry of Jesus Christ until he was lifted up. And the second book, he's writing on the second book, which is the book that he's writing, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach. So now he's writing a second book. Who is he writing to? Theophilus, which is the same person. This is how we know that Luke wrote the book of Luke as well as book of Acts. And he's writing to the same person. Once again, we don't know whether this is actual person's name or person he's actually just referencing without calling out his name, or he's writing to a people who call themselves as friend of God. We don't know. We don't know the details of this, the actual fact, but he's writing to a either individual or the group of people. He calls them friend of God. But what's important here is coming back to the book of Luke, chapter 1. He said on verse 4, that you may have a certainly concerning the things you have been taught. What we know for sure here is the person who he's writing to, he's already been taught about Jesus Christ. And he is the believer of Jesus Christ. So what you have learned, I am writing this to you to confirming what you learned as a valid. So it's just a confirming, it's a confirmation. What you learned, whether this is what you learned is actually truth or not, is I'm confirming this after I have interviewed, after I have read the books, I have met with people, validating, and then I'm rewriting this stories in orderly fashions and structured way so that you can understand and validate your faith is true. So the story that I'm sharing with you in the Bibles, and for those of you who have actually learned from me for many, many years, I'm sharing the same story that you have read before. You read the Bible before you met me and after you met me. So you heard the stories that you already knew. But what did you find different before you met or before you participated in this Bible sharing versus after you actually encountered this Bible sharing? It's the same story. It's not different from what you read before. You read the Bible before. You learned about Bible before. So you actually experienced the value of the words. So what's the difference between you actually read the Bible before versus after you actually encountered this or you participate in this Bible sharing? You get to see the things that you didn't see before. You get to hear things that you didn't know before. You get to actually hear the stories that are connected to other stories. If you knew the Bible story as just kind of, segmented stories or individual story, now what you see is all the stories are all connected, intertwined. And it actually talks about the same exact story about Jesus Christ. That's how you're able to just to bring all the dots together. That you're able to actually connect all the dots together. Now you see the full picture. As if you read the stories in the past, the Bibles, the way you read it was like a million pieces, not actually put it all together. So you actually see each pieces. Okay, I see this piece, I see that piece. So you saw as each piece is scattered all over the place. But as you actually participate in this Bible sharing, what you learned is we're putting these puzzles together so that once you started the puzzles together, what you see is, oh, the picture I did not see before I put all these puzzles together, now I see this picture. Now I see the image more clearly. Now I know what the story is about. That's what this actually Bible sharing is about. We're putting all the stories together. Same thing. Luke was exactly doing the same thing. People knew pieces of the story of Jesus Christ, and it's not organized. But now he's putting all this together, and starting to the end, he's actually just showing the full story, so from the beginning to the end, and how it structures what he taught, what he did, what he said, where he went, why he did what he did, And he was putting all this together so that everyone could understand better. So, the story that book of Luke is writing is very different than how book of Matthew and book of Mark was written. Much more structured way, organized way, in detail, concise, but essential. So, as we read the story of Luke, you will find it a little bit more interesting and more structured and organized than other two books that we have learned. So, therefore, as we actually go into verse 5, I'm going to go into a little more stories about what the stories of the book of Luke is actually talking about. Next Saturday when we meet, we're going to get into some may consider to be boring story, or some may see it as interesting story. It all depends on how you perceive, but I'm going to share some of the historical facts of the story that he's writing. So up to this point, we're just gonna cover up to the chapter 1, verse 1 through 4, so that you have some introductions of who Luke is and why he wrote what he wrote, and what kind of person he is, and some of the historical fact of exactly what purpose and what reason that he decided to write this the book of Luke. Okay. So, any question